Hello, welcome to the Old Testament Made Simple lesson number 11. Hope you have been enjoying the series to this point. It's been a great series, a lot of information. Hope you're hanging in there, memorizing your information and studying your past lessons. I want to again thank Melton Short for creating this study as well as allowing us to use it. We appreciate that. The idea of this information is to get a skeleton view of the entire Old Testament, just a framework view of the Old Testament that you can then later add all of the information needed to put together the entire Old Testament. So hopefully you're developing that skeleton view. We are taking 8 trips through the entire Old Testament. Today we'll be working on trip number 8. We've covered a lot of information so far. In our first trip through the Old Testament, we covered the geographical moves of the people of God, the children of Israel, from the Garden of Eden until they got back into Israel. We have talked about the 20 key people of the Old Testament. We've talked about the 3 major divisions of the Old Testament. We've talked about the 11 books that contain 95% of the story of the Old Testament and the children of Israel. Number 5, we've looked at ways to remember the content of each of the books in the Old Testament. In our 6th trip through, we looked at God's 7 major covenants. In number 7 last week, we looked at the 5 major time periods and began to put a lot of this information together. Today we're going to add more to that as we cover the 50 major events of the Old Testament today. So a lot of information we've already covered so far. Jason is our champion geographer, so we're going to let him come and give us the geography lesson for our area. All right, first of all, we make our room a map. So outside this back corner, we have Persian Gulf. Very good. The city just to the north? Speak loud so they can hear you on the video. The land up around the room and out the back corner is called what?
The Fertile Crescent.
Point that out for everybody on the video. Right there, the Fertile Crescent. Very good. Now there's a body of water, if our room is the map, just outside that wall. What is it?
Mediterranean Sea.
Point it out for us. Mediterranean Sea. Very good. And the nation just to the south of the Mediterranean Sea?
Egypt.
Point it out for us. Very good. Egypt. Very good. And now as you come back into the Fertile Crescent, the nation just up into the Fertile Crescent from Egypt is?
Israel.
Israel. Very good. And what is this land in between?
Desert.
Point it out for us. The desert. Very good. All right. Let's cover the rest of the map. One place at a time. Point it out as we go so the folks on the video know what we're talking about, okay? All right. The river to the north is?
Tigris.
The Tigris River. The next river to the south in the Fertile Crescent? The Euphrates River. Very good. And the river in Israel that's famous?
Jordan River.
The Jordan River. Very good. All right. Now let's label our map. Abraham moved to a city when he left Ur. Where did he move to?
Haran.
Haran. Point out Haran for us so the folks on the video can see.
To Haran.
Haran. Very good. Now let's look at coming from Egypt. The children of Israel crossed a large sea. What's the name of that?
Red Sea.
The Red Sea. Very good. Abraham stopped at a mountain to receive the 10 Commandments. What's the name of that mountain?
Mount Sinai.
Very good. Mount Sinai. All right. Now, as they wandered in the wilderness, they stopped at one nation before they went into Israel. What is that nation?
Moab.
Moab. Very good. Now, they were taken captive to a city. What's the name of that city?
Babylon.
Where is it on the map?
Right there.
Babylon. Very good. Now, where did it all begin? Point it out on the map where we can see. Eden. Very good. All right. Have a seat. Thank you, sir. All right. Miss Anne-Marie's going to come and go through our geographical moves of the children of Israel. Very good. All right. Where was move number 1?
From Eden to Ur.
Move number 1 was from Eden to Ur. Move number 2?
From Ur to Haran.
Great. Move number 3?
From Haran to Israel.
Move number 4?
From Israel to Egypt.
Move number 5?
From Egypt across Red Sea, through the desert, back to Israel.
Very good. Move number 6?
From Israel over to Babylon.
Good. And move number 7?
From Babylon all the way back to Israel.
Very good. Outstanding. Good job, Miss Anne-Marie. Thank you for doing that. All right, now we are going to go. We kind of already did the geography, but there's you a view of the geography labeled. Now, let's do our 20 key people. Anne-Marie wants to do this again for us. All right.
Okay. So you have Adam.
No. Let's go. Start with the titles. 20 key people. We have
Adam
the 6.
in Genesis.
The 6 in Genesis. Very good. They are
Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Joseph.
very good. Speak up clear so they can hear you on the video.
Okay.
All right. And now we have
Now you have
Israel's 11 leaders.
oh yeah.
Who starts with?
Moses.
Yes. Moses. Very good.
And then you have
The one right after Moses, one of the 2 spies.
I always forget.
Yes, Joshua. Anne-Marie always forgets. And then we have,
The 12 judges.
very good,
And Samuel.
Samuel. Very good. Now we start our kings, and our 11 leaders continued. Our first king was Saul. Very good. Second king, David.
Solomon. The 39 other kings.
39 kings of the divided kingdom.
And
After the exile, 3 leaders. Zerubbabel,
Ezra, and
Nehemiah. Very good. And then the other 3. Pharaoh,
Nebuchadnezzar,
and the prophets. And that gets our 20 key people. Good job, Anne-Marie. Man, have come a long way in naming our individuals, getting much better. I hope you at home are, as you are watching these videos, I hope it's becoming a little easier for you to name some of this information and some of these people and know what's going on. All right, now we have our 3 major divisions of the Old Testament. We have 17 historical books, 5 poetical books, and 17 prophetical books. These are also divided into sections of 5 and 12. So our first 5 books of the Bible make up what is called what?
The Pentateuch.
The Pentateuch. And those first 5 books are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Very good. That's the Pentateuch, the law, if you will, the first 5 books of history. Now the remaining 12 books are Joshua, Judges, Ruth,
1st and 2nd Samuel,
1st, 2nd Samuel,
1st and 2nd Kings,
1st, 2nd Kings,
1st and 2nd Chronicles,
1st, 2nd Chronicles,
Ezra,
Nehemiah,
Esther.
and Esther. Very good. Now we have 5 poetry books. They are Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes,
Song of Solomon.
and the Song of Solomon. Great. Now we have 5 major prophets. Who are they? Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel. Good. Now we have 12 minor prophets. Who are they? Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah,
Haggai, Zechariah,
Zechariah,
Malachi.
and Malachi. Very good, very good. Now I hope you're beginning to understand the books of the Old Testament. As you put them into these three major divisions, hopefully it will help you begin to recite the books of the Bible much easier and understand what's going on in each book. Now we're going to talk about the contents, the what's going on. We have 11 books that contain 95% of the story. Now this is the story of mankind from Eden all the way through till the time of Jesus Christ. So these 11 books give us 95% of the story. Those books are Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, Ezra, and Nehemiah. And then we have 6 other books, Deuteronomy, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, Ruth, Esther, and Leviticus. Now, let's talk about the contents of Genesis. What do we find in Genesis?
Creation to
From
the
creation
death of Joseph.
to the death of Joseph in
Egypt.
Egypt. Very good. What do we find in the Exodus?
The mass departure of the Israelites from Egypt.
The mass departure of the Israelites from Egypt. Very good. What do we see in Numbers?
The 2 major censuses.
The 2 major censuses. One right after they left Egypt and one when?
Right before they went back.
Right before they went back into the Promised Land. Now the remaining, the name of the book gives us an idea of what we'll find in the book. What will we find in the book of Joshua?
The story of Joshua.
The story of Joshua and the conquest of the land of Canaan. Very good. What we find in Judges?
All the different judges.
The 12
sin
judges and the sin cycle. Very good. 1 Samuel,
Samuel.
the story
and
of
Saul.
Samuel, and the first king, Saul. What we find in 2 Samuel?
The story of David.
Story of David. Very good. 1 Kings, 2 Kings. What will we find? First Kings.
You have Elijah.
Elijah's the major prophet.
And then in 2nd Kings you have Elisha.
Elisha is the major prophet in 2 Kings. But in the book of 1 Kings, 2 Kings, we get Solomon in 1 Kings and a few of the kings after the divided kingdom. And in 2 Kings, we get the remaining kings of the divided kingdom. Very good. Ezra.
That is the journey from Babylon back.
The
to
journey from
Israel.
Babylon back to Israel, establishing the temple and the priesthood. Ezra was a priest, and he led the second return. Zerubbabel led the first return. Ezra led the second return. And then Nehemiah.
The rebuilding of something.
The rebuilding of the city walls of Jerusalem. That's what we find in Nehemiah, and Nehemiah is the man that led that return. Okay, so he was a leader in Israel. Now, the other 6, what will we find in Deuteronomy?
They're summary books. So
These are summary books.
this Deuteronomy is the summary of the law for the 2nd generation.
Deuteronomy is the summary of the law for the 2nd generation. The first generation died in the wilderness. The second generation needed to know the law, so Moses retaught the law to the second generation. 1st and 2nd Chronicles.
Those are the summary of like the kings and stuff.
It's the summary of the kings. We have in 1st Chronicles, Solomon, and some of the kings of the divided kingdom. And in 2nd Chronicles, we have the remaining kings of the divided kingdom. What is different between Chronicles and Kings?
It only talks about Judah's kings.
Chronicles only talks about Judah's kings, not Israel's kings. Very good. Ruth and Esther.
Those are biographies.
Biographies of these 2 ladies. What about Ruth?
Ruth is wherever you go, I go.
Ruth said, wherever you go, I'll go, to her mother-in-law Naomi, and she moved back to the promised land with Naomi. Esther.
If I perish, I perish.
If I perish, I perish. What did Esther do?
She was a queen and she went to the king trying to get her people to be able to leave.
She's a queen. She went to her king to request safety for her people that were going to be destroyed by a wicked man by the name of Haman. Very good. If I perish, I perish. She risked her life to save her people. Leviticus.
That's the priest handbooks for the Levites.
Priest's handbook for the tribe of Levi. The Levites. Very good. So that gets us the history books. We talk about the sin cycle, the 5-step sin cycle in the book of Judges. They would stray away from God. God would send an enemy nation to oppress them. They would cry out to God. God would raise up a leader or a judge. As long as that judge lived, they would serve God. When that judge died, they would drop back into the sin cycle again. They went through this cycle over and over and over again in the book of Judges. Our comparison of the two nations, north, south. In the north we had Israel. In the south we had Judah. In the north there were 10 tribes. In the south there were 2 tribes. In the north the capital was Samaria. In the south the capital was Jerusalem. In the north they had 19 kings. In the south they had 20 kings. In the north, no good kings. In the south, 8 good kings. Okay? All right, now let's talk about our 5 books of poetry. What do we find in the book of Job?
The story of him suffering.
Suffering, human suffering. And the book of Job shows us that the righteous also suffer. Psalms, what do we see here?
Songs and poetry.
Songs and poetry. Proverbs.
Wisdom.
Wisdom, very good. Song of Solomon.
God's love for us and human love for each other.
Human love for each other and God's love for us. Ecclesiastes.
The riddle of man's existence.
Riddle of man's existence. Very good, very good. Now, in the 17 prophetical books, there's 2 ways to help us remember the books. First of all, we want to know when they preached. All the prophetical books are sermons. They were written from a preacher to people. So we need to know when they preached, and we need to know to who they preached. And if we know these 2 things, we can understand the 17 prophecy books. All right, now let's look at the when. Most all the books centered around the Babylonian captivity or exile. Move number 6 and move number 7. Okay? So most of the when was sometime around the Babylonian captivity. So that'll help us to put it into perspective. The last 3 major prophets, the last 3 were during the exile. The last 3 minor prophets were after the exile. And all of the rest were before. Let's look at that. 5 major prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel. Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel were during the exile. Isaiah and Jeremiah were before. The minor prophets we have here, the last 3, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, after the exile. Okay? The rest were before. Okay? So the when we can know by that. The last 3 major was during. The last 3 minor was after. Everyone else before. Now, to who? Who did they preach? All but 5 preached to Judah. All of the 17 but 5, so 12, preached to Judah. The other 5, if you put the first letter of the name of the book, it spells out the word Jonah. Okay? So let's name the 5 that spell out Jonah, because they preached to somebody other than Judah. Everybody else preached to Judah. All right, so Jonah, we have J for Jonah, O for Obadiah, N for Nahum, A for Amos, and H for Hosea. Okay? Jonah. These 5 preached to somebody other than Judah. Jonah and Nahum preached to Nineveh. Obadiah, Edom. Amos and Hosea, the northern kingdom of Israel. Now, it's important to notice that only 2 prophets preached to the northern kingdom of Israel. God didn't waste his time on Israel. Israel had no good kings. They had no plan on serving God. They worshiped in temples other than the one in Jerusalem. They were ungodly from the beginning, and God never favored them. God only sent 2 prophets to preach to the northern kingdom. All right. Now, let's talk about the 7 major covenants. What was the first covenant in the Old Testament?
The Adamic. No,
The Edenic.
Yeah.
Uh-oh, my thing's going to get off on us. The Edenic covenant.
Yeah.
The second was the Adamic covenant. This one was made after they were kicked out of Eden. This one included physical labor, a curse upon the land, the animals would fear mankind, and children would be conceived painfully in childbirth. Okay? The Noahic covenant. What did that talk about?
That's when God promised that if Noah would build an ark, that he would save his family.
Noah found favor in God's eyes, and God made a covenant with Noah to start over the human race through him and his children. And God told Noah to build an ark. Very good. Number 4, what is the Abrahamic covenant?
The seeds would, something about an heir.
Okay, first of all, there were 2 parts of the Abrahamic covenant. First, God would make a great nation out of Abraham.
Yeah.
Okay? And the second, all families of the earth would be blessed through his seed. And that was a reference to Jesus Christ and the Messiah. Okay? Very good. What is the Mosaic covenant? Moses received this. The 10 Commandments constitutes the Mosaic covenant. Moses received the Mosaic covenant on Mount Sinai. But what we need to know is God first audibly spoke the 10 Commandments to the children of Israel. He made this covenant through his voice to the children of Israel. The Davidic covenant. What is this covenant? David had a heart for God. He loved God. He saw that God was dwelling in a tent, the tabernacle, and he was living in a house made of cedar wood. What did he decide to do?
Build him a temple.
He wanted to build a house for God and a place of worship for God. And because David wanted to do that, God made David a promise. What was that promise?
You will always have an heir on the throne.
He would always have an heir on the throne. That's why Jesus Christ is of the tribe of Judah. He's a descendant of David, and he's the eternal king from now and forever. So that covenant is forever confirmed in Jesus Christ. David's heir on the throne forever. Now the last covenant.
The new covenant. This happened when Jesus came and died on the cross and rose again for us so we could go to heaven.
Very good. The new covenant is a result of Jesus Christ's death, burial, and resurrection so that we can all accept him as our personal Savior, ask him to forgive us of our sins, and we can go to heaven. Very good. This one is a culmination of all the others. All right, very good. We are moving right along. Now we have 5 major time periods that we talked about last week. First time period is before Israel became a nation. What is this?
That was like Genesis, creation.
That was from creation until the people of Israel moved into Egypt. Okay? Alright, so from creation until Egypt, that's before Israel became a nation. Israel in Egypt is time period number 2. This is about 430 years that they lived in Egypt and became a great nation. So this is before they became a nation, and this is after or as they were becoming a nation. Okay? Because they increased from 70 people to about 2.4 million people while they were in Egypt. Okay? So number 2 is a large increase in the children of Israel as they're becoming a nation rather than just a family. Okay? And then move number 3 was Israel in the wilderness. What happened here?
They crossed the Red Sea, and then they were stuck in the wilderness.
They crossed the Red Sea. They went to the Promised Land. They sent in 12 spies. 2 spies said they could take the land. 10 said they could not. As a result of their fear, God sent them into the wilderness, and they wandered for 40 years while the older generation died. So that's what happens in number 3, is Israel in the wilderness. Time period number 4, this is back in the Promised Land, and this is the height of the civilization of Israel. When we talk about civilizations, we talk about the height of a civilization, the time when they flourished the most. They had the most territory, the most resources. Their government was the greatest. So back in the Promised Land, that's what occurs during this period of time. A lot of great things happen in Israel right here. It ends with this group of people not serving God and not doing what God wanted them to do. And God allowed an enemy to come in and take over. And that gives us move number 5. The exile to Babylon and beyond. Jewish history up until Jesus Christ is covered in move number 5. All right. Now, that gets us to our lesson for today. Review takes up more of the lesson now than the actual lesson does. But this is lesson number 11, the 50 major events of the Old Testament. And this is our last lesson that presents new information. When we do lesson number 12 next week, that will be putting it all together. Okay? So this is our last bit of new information. Now, we're going to go through these events based on time periods. Now, I want you to think about something. If you met a total stranger somewhere out, maybe at a park or at an event that you had attended, you met a total stranger. If that total stranger told you 50 events about their life, when you walked away from that conversation, you would know more about that person than you know about most of your best friends. I want you to think about that. If you picture one of your best friends, how many events do you know about that person? Okay? That's what we want to do with the Old Testament. We want to pick up 50 events that occurred in the Old Testament, and when you know those 50 events, you'll have an amazing understanding of the entire book considered to be the Old Testament. Okay? So that's what we want to try to work on today, is 50 major events. Now, we're not going to go into a lot of detail on these events. A lot of them, when you see the event, it's immediately going to trigger some Sunday school lessons, some Bible school lessons, and some information. And so I want you to, in your mind, just kind of get an overall, okay, I kind of know what went on in that story. Not that you know every detail about the story, but you're like, oh yeah, I know that story. And when we get through this lesson today, I think you're going to be surprised how much you actually know about the Old Testament, and you just don't realize you know it. All right, here we go. Time period number 1, before Israel became a nation. Okay, this is from creation to Joseph's death in Egypt, about 2,000 years. Okay, so of course we have creation. That's the first event. In creation, God 7 days created everything that we have with us here today, including mankind. In 7 days, God created everything. Okay? Genesis chapter 1, the first 5 words are?
In the beginning,
God
created.
Very good. So Genesis 1 and 1, the first 5 words were, in the beginning God created. Very good. Now, shortly after creation, we have the fall of man. That's when sin entered in. That's when Satan deceived Eve. God had told them not to eat from the fruit from the tree in the center of the garden. They could eat anything else they wanted to. They could not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They ended up eating from that tree, and as a result, God had told them they would die. So God kicked them out of Eden, and they were forced to work for their food, and a lot of other things happened bad. Now, man continued to grow and got smarter and smarter and did a lot of crazy things, but at the time of Noah, there was nobody good in the world except Noah. So God saved Noah and his family on the ark, and that story is called the flood. Okay? So we have creation, fall of man, and the flood. Now, beginning of languages. We just kind of talked about this in our Sunday school lesson this past Sunday. What happened here? What's the city, or what's the Tower of Babel? Very good. The beginning of languages at the Tower of Babel. Very good. Now, between the flood, we had the Tower of Babel, and then we had the call of Abraham. Where did Abraham live? In Ur. Very good. Just north of the Persian Gulf. So God called Abraham and said, Abraham, move to a land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and all families of the earth will be blessed through your seed. Okay. Then Abraham had a son. His name was Isaac. So the birth of Isaac, stories around Isaac. And then we have the birth of Jacob, Isaac's son. Jacob's name becomes Israel. Jacob has 12 sons who are later going to become the 12 tribes of Israel. Joseph, one of the younger brothers, gets sold into Egypt, and then Jacob's family moves to Egypt. All right? So, wow, look how many stories you're probably already familiar with in the first time period. All right? Very good. Hope you got those. Those of you at home looking, if you want to pause your screen to copy down the events, you're welcome to do so, and then pick right back up. All right, period number 2, Israel in Egypt. Now, Jacob's family moves to Egypt, 70 go in, and they soon become a nation, around 2 million people. Okay? Now, there arises a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. Now, if you remember the story of Joseph in Egypt, Joseph goes down to Egypt and he interprets the Pharaoh's dream. The Pharaoh has a dream of 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine. Joseph interprets that dream, and Pharaoh puts him over harvesting all the grain. So during the 7 years of plenty, Joseph stores grain, and during the 7 years of famine, his family runs out of corn in Israel. They come to Egypt looking for corn, and Joseph is able to bring them into Egypt, give them a place to live, and take care of them during the famine years. They ended up staying. 400 years in the land of Egypt. During this period of time, a Pharaoh is born who doesn't know Joseph, and doesn't know the children of Israel, and doesn't know why they're there, and he becomes fearful of the children of Israel to the point that he says, we're going to start killing all the male babies in Israel. In the Israelites that were living in Egypt, okay? Because their population is so great, the Egyptians were afraid they were going to take over. So out of fear, this Pharaoh begins killing the male children of the Hebrews, the children of Israel. Well, at this period of time then, Moses is born. Mom puts him in a little basket and sends him out on the Nile River, and Pharaoh's daughter adopts Moses, and Moses becomes a great person in Egypt. Now, after Moses gets to be an adult, he sees the Hebrews being beaten by the Egyptians, and that bothers Moses quite a bit. So Moses, at one point in time, actually kills an Egyptian. And after he kills the Egyptian, he has to flee away from Egypt. So he goes out into the desert. He's living in the desert, And then we have the story of the burning bush. What happened at the burning bush?
He talked to God.
God talked to Moses through a bush that was on fire, but it was not being burnt up. Okay? So God talked to Moses through the burning bush. What did he want Moses to do?
Let his people
Go back and talk to Pharaoh. Let his people go. That's exactly what Moses was to say. To go to Pharaoh and say, let my people go. So God sent Moses after the burning bush. He sent him back into Egypt to talk to Pharaoh. Possibly not this Pharaoh, but maybe this Pharaoh's son, who may have been a person that knew Moses. They may have had a relationship. So Moses now goes back to possibly this guy's son and says, you got to let the Hebrews go. All right? Then we have the 10 plagues that God pours out on Egypt in order to let the children of Israel go. So we have the 10 plagues. Then we have what's called the Passover. What is the Passover?
Where they put the lamb's blood over the door.
They put the lamb's blood over their door facings on the last night they were in Egypt, and the death angel would pass over, and the firstborn of every household that had the blood applied would live. Every household that did not have the blood applied, included Pharaoh's son, would die. Okay, and so a lot of firstborn died in Egypt on this particular night, the Passover. Then we have the Exodus. What is the Exodus?
The departure of the Israelites from Egypt.
The departure of the Israelites from Egypt. Very good. All right, those are the events that occurred during time period number 2. Now, time period number 3. This is Israel in the wilderness, the time from the time they left Egypt until they go into the promised land. First of all, we have the law at Mount Sinai. That's where God writes the 10 Commandments on the stone tablets for Moses. Then we have the tabernacle. We've talked a little bit about the tabernacle. The tabernacle was a tent of worship. It was a portable tent that could move with the children of Israel in the wilderness from place to place, and God's presence was in the tabernacle, okay? Inside the tabernacle, we would find the table of showbread, we would find the menorah, the light stand, the altar of incense, we would find the Ark of the Covenant. Inside the ark would be the 10 Commandments, a bowl of manna, Aaron's rod that budded. These are some things that would be in the tabernacle, and that's where God was worshipped, okay? And then we had the 12 spies. After the tabernacle was built, they got to the promised land, were about to go into the promised land, sent in 12 spies, who were the only 2 spies that said we can take the land.
Joshua
and Caleb.
And Caleb. Joshua and Caleb said we can take it. But the other 10 said we could not. So then we have the wilderness wanderings. The children of Israel left the promised land. Now this would have occurred in a very short period of time. Now they're going to go into the wilderness, and basically they felt like they were always going forward. But in reality, they were only going around in circles. Okay? So the wilderness wanderings. Then we have the new generation taught at Moab, that little city right before going into the promised land. Moses reteaches the book of Deuteronomy to the new generation, and they're ready to take the promised land. And then Moses dies, and Joshua takes over as the second leader of the children of Israel. That occurs in time period number 3. Okay? All right, let's move on. Now, time period number 4, back in the promised land, the next 1,000 years. Oh my goodness. What a list of things happened during this period of time, okay? This is our longest list, but here it is. This is the height of the civilization of Israel. So you would expect a lot of things to happen during this time period. They first crossed Jordan. Jordan was at flood stage when the children of Israel went in. God stayed the water, and the children of Israel crossed over the river Jordan, even though it was at flood stage, on dry ground, just like he had allowed them to cross the Red Sea. So they crossed into Jordan. Then they divided the land amongst the 12 tribes of Israel. Then we have the time of the judges. Okay? Sin cycle over and over and over again. Then we have the story where Ruth follows Naomi back to Israel. Samuel ministers at the end of the time of the judges. Samuel. Then we have, after Samuel, the people rejected his sons, didn't want them to rule over them, wanted a king. Israel demands a king. Saul gets anointed as the first king. David becomes the second king. Solomon becomes the third king. The temple is built. Remember, David wanted to build a temple for God. That's how we get the Davidic covenant. David wanted to build the temple. God told David, David, you got blood on your hands. You're a warrior. You're a general. You fought a lot of battles. We're not going to let you do it. Solomon is going to build the temple. Okay? So Solomon builds the temple. This is David's son. He builds the temple. And then after the death of Solomon, the kingdom divides into north and south. Israel in the north, Judah in the south. Then we have the ministry of Elijah, 1 Kings. The ministry of Elisha, 2 Kings. And then we have the prophets preach to the nation of Israel and to the nation of Judah. These prophets preached before the exile. Okay? So this was the period 4 back in the promised land. And we have some prophets preaching. A lot of good things and some bad things happened during time period number 4. Now, time period number 5. The exile in Babylon and beyond. They were in Babylon for 70 years. And then they were allowed to return to Jerusalem and continue Jewish history up until the birth of Jesus Christ. Okay? So these are the last events before the New Testament. First of all, Israel gets scattered by the Assyrians. Now, Israel wasn't taken captive. They were scattered all over the face of the earth. The Assyrians came in and took over the northern 10 tribes. They took the people, they sold them into slavery all over the world. So the Assyrians scattered Israel, the northern 10 tribes. Babylon carries Judah away captive. Judah is the southern 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin. They are carried captive to Babylon. Ezekiel, if you remember, Ezekiel is one of the prophets during the Babylonian captivity. Ezekiel has visions of the end of time. And those are called Ezekiel's visions. He saw visions of things that might look like airplanes or whatever. But Ezekiel sees the end of time. And he's one of the prophetic books of the end of time. Okay? Now, we have, while we're in Babylon, the 3 Hebrew children were thrown into the fiery furnace. What's their names?
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Very good job, Jason. Nailed that one quickly. Anne-Marie was right on your heels, but you got it. All right, Daniel in the lion's den. This occurred during the Babylonian captivity. Now, after a period of time, Nebuchadnezzar dies. His son is elevated to king, and his son does a really bad thing that angers God. And God tells him that he's going to allow him to be overthrown. And so the Persians overthrow the Babylonian kingdom and take over. Under the Persian kings, they were kinder to the Hebrews, and they allowed the Hebrews to return to Jerusalem. Okay? So the Hebrews that were under captivity in Babylon, after the Persians took over, they allowed them to begin migrating back to Jerusalem. Okay? So Judah returns to Jerusalem. Esther becomes queen and saves her people. The Jewish holiday called Purim is a reflection of what Esther does and how she saved her people. Then we have 3 prophets that preached after the exile: Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And they preached to the people of Israel after they returned from Babylon. Then we have 400 years from the time of Malachi until the time of Jesus Christ is about 400 years. And those are called the silent years. There was no prophecy during that period of time. There was no Bible book written during that period of time. They're called the silent years. And then you have the birth of Jesus Christ and the beginning of the New Testament. Okay? Now that completes the 50 major events in the Old Testament. Wow! How many of those did you know? Even before we itemize them. A lot, right? You know a lot of those stories. If you don't know a lot of those stories, now you can go back and begin to piece together the events of those stories so that you have a good, clear understanding. All right, next week we have one more lesson, and that will complete our study of the Old Testament Made Simple by Mr. Melton Short. Next week we will tie it all together. We won't present any new information. We'll take all the information that you have and we'll put it all together. Now, I don't know how I'm going to be able to put it all together so that you can see it on the screen. We'll have to kind of figure that out as we go. But join us next week as we try to tie it all together for you and complete this study. Have a good day.